I wish I could say that, as is sometimes the case in these forums, the question that is posed about the general capital increase were rhetorical, and we know that we will come through and support it. But frankly, as we're gathering here this afternoon, the outcome of the question regarding the United States participation and level of that participation in the GCI is, in fact, not a foregone conclusion. And so I am personally very excited to be here with two outstanding U.S. executive directors representing us respectively on the board of the Inter-American Development Bank, Gustavo Arnavat, and on the board of the World Bank, Ian Solomon. Now, I say USCD representing us, but in fact, I think at the outset it might be good to call attention to the fact that the charters of these institutions stipulate that, in fact, as a director, one must operate in the interests of the entirety of the membership. They're genuinely multilateral, at least aspirationally. So that while Gustavo and Ian do, in fact, have, I'm sure, very extensive dialogue with the U.S. Treasury, which in the United States context oversees and serves as the governor for each of these institutions, they also interact very closely with their colleagues, other representing and people from other member governments on that board, and that is a rich part of this experience. And so today, as we talk about this general capital increase, I know their colleagues on the board are looking to them to understand what is the United States going to do here. And so that's a discussion that we'll enter in just a moment. Let me tell you briefly about each of them. I don't know whether in your materials you have their very distinguished biographies. Let me start with Gustavo, who I learned as we were gathering for this event actually was born in Cuba and grew up in Miami. And unlike many, when a president comes into office and people who've been active in the campaign are looking at how they might serve their country, there's quite a lot of clamor, as I recall, for ambassadorships. But Gustavo was sharing with me that that would not be his role of choice, that in fact, he was attracted to the IDB, bringing quite a great background in both law and banking. He was with Citigroup's private bank for a number of years. He wanted to be a part of the general capital increase because he thought he could make a difference by being there at this time. So we're very excited to have him here with us. He is both holds a law degree and an undergraduate degree from Cornell University, and he also went to the Kennedy School. So we're glad to have him in public service and glad to have him here. Ian Solomon came to the board of the World Bank from the Treasury, where he was a senior advisor to Secretary Tim Geithner, who, as I recall at your swearing in, said he couldn't understand why you wanted to leave Treasury and go across the street to the World Bank. He previously was on the Senate staff of then Senator Barack Obama as his legislative counsel, and before that was Associate Dean at the Yale Law School. So with that, I want to dive into our discussion. But all of you are very much a part of this conversation, and we are going to reserve time to turn this over to you. And I want to start with you and just ask you, how many of you are familiar with the Multilateral Development Bank system? And don't be shy. I mean, it's so most of you, okay. And let me ask you also, how important, and honestly, how important do you personally believe these institutions to be to U.S. national security? Let's say, do you think they're very important? Show of hands. Okay. Some of you may have some doubts. How important do you think they are for addressing poverty and stimulating economic development globally? Show of hands. Very important? Okay. And finally, do you think it would be consequential if the United States lost the privilege of being the country to nominate the president of the World Bank? That very important? Does that seem very important to you, or is that time past? Okay, so we see, I should say for the benefit of those online, that there was not a lot of thinking that that was a critical privilege to retain. I want to say first just the basic facts about the general capital increase that we're going to dive in on in a moment. This is really a once-in-a-generation ask. Not since 1988 have we been in this position. So it's not something that we need to step up to every year. We are looking at $400 million a year for 5 years, but it's not going to come around again anytime soon. And the format we're going to pursue here is that I will pose some questions to our panelists, but I'm also going to invite them to raise issues and points if I don't ask the right question, and to engage directly with one another, and they'll probably throw out some questions for you as well. And then once we've had our first round, we will come out to you in the audience. There are 3 areas that we're going to cover in the questioning, so you know where we're going in this. First, I'm going to ask them each to give their own perspectives of what it's like to operate on the board of these institutions. You know, in governance terms, one would never imagine that a director is a full-time employee of the institution serving on the board. But in fact, that is the case. This is a full-time engagement for them to be inside the institution and directors on its board. And I'd love to know from each of them a little bit, and for you to get a flavor of how do these institutions operate, what is it like to be inside, and from that stance, why is the GCI important? And what is the U.S. role in achieving the GCI? Then I'm going to follow up to give them an opportunity to tell us a little bit about the development impact of the institutions they're in. Why do they make a difference? And finally, we're going to explore the consequences of what would happen if the United States doesn't participate in the GCI, as is a possibility. Gustavo, let me start with you. Tell me, what's your experience been in serving on the IDB board? What's the job? And how does your view, being there, affect your sense of this general capital increase, how the United States should participate in it, and what our outlook is?
It's a complex question. But first, Jan, thank you very much, and also to Sid and all of you being here. It's been, since I've been on the job for almost 2 years, and very much focused on this issue of the global capital increase, although the negotiations began at least a year before I got there in earnest, after I got there. And I think one of the biggest frustrations for me has been how little is known outside of Washington development circles about the IDB, the World Bank, and other development institutions. So I really welcome this opportunity to speak about this. And although I know since most of you in the audience are already very familiar, but perhaps other people watching the live stream will benefit as well from learning about what we do. This is an institution. I mean, it's hard for me to answer that question without describing somewhat the corporate governance, which you alluded to. And I can only do so, of course, with the IDB. But there are 48 member countries, 26 of whom are borrowing countries, 22 non-borrowing countries. The United States is by far the largest shareholder. We own 30% of the shares. Argentina and Brazil come next at around roughly 10 or 11%.
That's very helpful.
At the board, and so when I think of the governance, I think of sort of 3 institutions. You have the Board of Governors, which is the highest supervisory authority. Tim Geithner, as Secretary of Treasury, is the governor of the United States. Tim, I hear, has a lot of important things on his mind these days, so he delegates on a daily basis sort of day-to-day supervision of the bank to people like, in my case, in the United States, to me. So you have a board of executive directors, and there are 14 directors. And then you have professional management. In the case of the IDB, it's led by Luis Alberto Moreno, former ambassador of Colombia, who did a very effective job in that role. Ambassador for 8 years. He's been the president of the bank for the last 6 years or so. And of course, he directs the staff of the organization. We are a full-time board, and I think we have to be because of the nature of the shareholders. The shareholders are governments. And in the case of borrowing shareholders, the kinds of decisions that we make really have a huge effect on these countries. And so it's important for them, it's important for us to be involved in pretty much every aspect of the bank, and that's why it's a full-time board. Now, one thing I should mention is, as far as my experiences, although we are the largest shareholder, and their charter provides certain protections to us at the Board of Governors level, such as choosing a president, such as increasing or decreasing the capital, or changing the capital structure of the bank, for example. At the Board of Executive Directors level, it's based on a majority vote. And because the borrowers collectively own more than 50%, and because they often get together to vote for their fellow borrowers' programs, it can be a little frustrating to be the USED. when you're very much focused on good governance issues. I think if other EDs were to be honest, and I think they are, they understand there's an inherent conflict of interest, which, Jan, you alluded to earlier. We actually wear two hats. We have the hat of a director. We have certain fiduciary responsibilities based on the charter. But at the same time, we also represent our countries. And if you're a borrower, one of your responsibilities is to ensure that your country is getting the kind of programming that is required in order to help advance your economy, et cetera. But I think having said that, I work extremely well with my fellow EDs, both from non-borrowing countries and borrowing countries. It is also, it's a diplomatic position as well. It's one of the reasons we go to the Foreign Relations Committee. And that's a role that I enjoy very much as well, working closely with Treasury and other U.S. government agencies to formulate our policy with respect to a particular country.
And you drawn out there, which I didn't say earlier, that these are nominated positions that are subject to nomination by the President, but confirmation by the United States Senate. So you both went through your confirmation hearings. Let me turn to you, Ian, and talk a little bit about what it's like to having, against Tim Geithner's advice, stepped over to be the USED at the World Bank. What's it like operating inside the institution, and what perspective has this given you on the role you think we should play in the general capital increase?
Great. Thank you, Jan, and thank you to Joe and to Stacy and to all of you for being here. I think your mission, the mission of really having a conversation about the criticality of international developments and transfers to our U.S. interests is critically important. So I applaud you for making the time, and I thank you for my predecessor as USED, the World Bank, not immediate predecessor, but Jan's a role model I look to because she was there during the Clinton administration, and I keep finding new and interesting things that she did as ED and try to copy them. So thank you for that. So I wanted to leave Treasury and come to the World Bank because, as the administration has made very clear, and as I think SID understands, development is a moral, strategic, and economic imperative for the United States. It's a moral imperative because any world where 1 out of 6 live in extreme poverty, without access to health, without access to security, is a world that's hard to justify under any religious or secular code of justice. And the U.S. stands for better than that, so it's a moral imperative for us. It's also a strategic imperative for us. Many of the issues we deal with, whether it's on climate change or on global food security or fragile and conflict situations that cause real challenges for the U.S., those are issues where the development plays a key role in resolving conflict, ensuring stability, ensuring food security, ensuring environmental sustainability over time. So it's a strategic imperative for the U.S. And finally, it's an economic imperative because we all know that right now we're struggling, like many countries, with employment. We need to find more jobs. We need to create jobs, rebuild, and deal with some economic headwinds we still face from Europe and other parts of the world. 95% of the world's consumers do not live in the United States, live outside our borders. So we need to make sure that U.S. firms can compete better in those markets where economies are growing 3 times faster in the developing world than the developed world. So I think the bank and both Secretary Geithner has testified to this. It's an indispensable partner in achieving our objectives. Indispensable on the moral side, the strategic side, and the economic side. So I see my job represented with the great privilege, sometimes called an extravagant privilege, of representing the U.S.'s largest shareholder in the World Bank. To really be about, okay, how do I best align what the bank is doing, where its resources are going, how it's acting with our U.S. priorities. Now, of course, we do wear these 2 hats, but my sense very strongly is that U.S. interests align very well with what's in the best interest of the institution. So we work very hard to make sure that the bank is. The bank just did a great report recently that on the World Development Report on gender for 2012. Gender is an issue that the U.S. pushes a lot more than some other shareholders you might imagine. This is an area where we can try to push the intellectual and the institutional and intellectual resources of the institution on areas we think are important. The next World Development Report is going to be on jobs. Again, a critical priority for the U.S. to worry about. But I see my job as how do I best advance these strategic imperatives for the United States. And we've been quite clear. Many of you maybe participated in the policy dialogue for the U.S. global development policy. And that global development policy is pretty clear. It says it wants to strengthen our multilateral capabilities. That aligns very well with what I try to do as a board member. It said we want to focus on broad-based economic growth and democratic governance. I don't use the word democratic so much, but accountable governance in the bank is a little more palatable. But really, how do we ensure that that's what the World Bank does? It focuses on broad-based economic growth and accountable governance. It talks about strengthening country ownership of their own development strategies, knowing that we can't dictate it from the top down and tell countries how they can develop. It won't work. It hasn't worked. What works is getting countries to own the development strategies themselves. That very much aligns with the World Bank's model of working with countries to own the development strategies. It talks about, our U.S. strategy talks about greater selectivity, recognizing that the U.S. can't do everything everywhere best. We need to find partners. And a big part of representing the U.S. at the World Bank is to make sure the bank is also being selective and aligning well with what USAID is doing, what the Millennium Challenge Corporation is doing, with our other bilateral issues, as well as other partners from other countries around the world. And finally, the last point I talked about for the global development policy, our global development policy, it emphasizes game-changing innovations. So I see my role in the bank is how do we make this bank, which is a 65-plus-year-old institution, formed in a different era, how do we make it more innovative? How do we make it more responsive? I know you've been quite active with your work, trying to find kind of innovations in development, better ways to target small and micro enterprises, better ways to support women entrepreneurs. So how do we help this bank be more agile, be more flexible? And I think we've seen great success. I think, like you, Gustavo, I'm always amazed that Americans don't really understand the bank very well. And to the extent they do, oftentimes they know a bank from a different era. And I at one time was on the outside complaining about the bank too, but it's nice to see, and I still complain periodically, but it's nice, it's an institution that actually can change, and has changed. It's gotten far more transparent and accountable, in part thanks to a strong U.S. presence, a strong U.S. voice on these issues. It actually pays a lot more attention to issues of social safety nets, and it still imposes conditions on borrowers, but it's much more sensitive to the poorest in those countries. It's not just the macro issues. So I think it's an institution that has changed, thanks in part to a strong U.S. role. So I think it's an extraordinary privilege to get to advocate and articulate these visions for the institution alongside an increasingly complicated global environment.
Well, and let's talk a little bit about the effectiveness of the development assistance that is provided through these institutions. I know we were talking earlier, for example, about trade and with reference to jobs, the role that the work of the Inter-American Development Bank can play on that front. Could you each give some sort of tangible examples of where you have seen the institutions make a difference?
Well, that's a good example of where we're helping the region at the same time where that programming is aligned with U.S. interest. And so the IDB has been involved for a number of years working very closely with various governments, particularly those governments that enter into free trade agreements with the United States, to help them do whatever they have to do to be able to follow those agreements, to be able to commit themselves as they have in the agreements. And so one tangible example is working with their customs officials to be able to reduce the number of days for the goods of many countries to go through from 3 weeks to 3 days or whatever it is in order to help promote free trade.
This is a very direct effect on our businesses that are trying to do business in Latin America.
Yeah, I think trade and opening borders, which I think is important for the U.S. business community, but important for global growth generally, because growth is going to benefit everybody. But there's another example where the bank got involved in Africa, where, as we know, the very small markets that oftentimes, it's hard to have good economies of scale unless we can break down some of the barriers between markets. The bank got engaged with Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda on some border crossing issues, and was able to bring down the cargo clearance time from 2 days to 7 hours. Again, but that means fewer vegetables rotting in trucks. It means you can better get food to market and get, and solve that. Other examples, another example from Africa in Tanzania. One of the challenges many developing countries face, as we all know in this room, is you have many different bilateral aid partners going in and trying to advise these various government ministries and things. So the bank worked with 7 different bilateral donors in Tanzania to create like a health basket fund. Okay, let's all talk together, work together, and let's focus on child mortality. And they brought down child mortality rates by 50%. So those are kind of concrete examples. We also, from the U.S., we call upon the bank quite extensively to help us in our strategic areas. Afghanistan is a great example, where the bank's been very active, along with the Asian Development Bank, focusing on major infrastructure projects, where the U.S. really wants to see the Afghan economy improve its governance, get democratic participation and grow. The bank was also very active with the National Solidarity Program, a kind of very different model of real innovation within the bank, where the bank normally lends to governments. It has the IFC, which invests in private sector. The bank only lends to governments. But in Afghanistan, that gets a little complicated. So they created a national solidarity program where they can actually work with village level. And they did 50,000 small grants, about $30,000 each, to village level, councils, which can do wells, irrigation, roads, bridges, schoolrooms, rural electrification projects, and touching about 2/3 of the rural Afghan population. Again, and this is part of the thing that I think inspired the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of Treasury to say, we need these institutions to be strong for our national security objectives.
Well, that gets us into the general capital increase. Go.
I just want to add, talk a little earlier about the innovation. In the case of the IDB, for example, we've been working with countries for a number of years on so-called conditional cash transfers. It's a way of dealing with poverty. In the past, to the extent that countries had the funds to do so, they would send out checks or give money to the poor. Now what we do is work closely with these governments so that at the same time that they provide those funds, they condition the provision of those funds to having, let's say, mothers or fathers take their kids for annual checkups, attend schools. So at the same time you're addressing poverty issues, you're also addressing health and educational issues.
Let's talk now about the general capital increase, which is needed to begin to continue to finance these activities. Say a little bit about it from the perspective first of the Inter-American Development Bank. What's involved? Why is it important? What's your role as USCD in supporting the U.S.?
So in the case of the IDB, since 1959, the IDB has provided approximately $200 billion in loans or guarantees or technical assistance grants to the region. Up until the global financial crisis that began roughly 2007-2008, the bank, for the preceding 10 years or since the last capital increase, which in the case of the IDB was 1984, the bank's programming was approximately $6 to $7 billion per year. When the financial crises occurred, the bank stepped up. We actually also received some infusion of temporary capital from one non-borrowing member, which allowed an increase in programming to up to $16 billion in 2009. Without the capital increase, we would go back to lending approximately $6 to $7 billion per year. What we're asking for is a capital increase of $70 billion, the vast majority of which would be in callable capital. Only $1.7 billion would be in the form of paid-in capital, and because the United States owns 30% of the bank, we would have to pay $510 billion, contribute that amount over 5 years, or roughly $102 million per year. But that will enable the bank to roughly double lending to 11 or 12 billion.
So there's very high leverage in that.
That's huge, because basically for that $510 billion over the next 5 years, that will enable the bank to lend an additional roughly $25 billion. And we don't see a need for another capital increase for a long, long time, if ever. And so, just multiply that 25 billion, every 5 years or so, so $50 billion in 10 years, simply because we're able to provide that $510 million. My role has been, when I first arrived at the bank, there was a discussion that certainly involved management. They certainly had to provide key financial figures to enable the shareholders to do their analysis. But the discussions were largely at the shareholders level. So Treasury was very much engaged in these discussions with other shareholders. But I was very much a part of that team, providing analysis, providing information, also providing advice on some of the negotiations. The major negotiations took place in Cancun, of all places, and around spring break, of all times. So it was March of 2010 when we spent many hours putting the final touches on the capital increase, because it's important to mention that it's not just the numbers; it's also what the United States got for it. Because we have, because it's only every 15 or 20 years or so. That's when we were able to exercise our maximum leverage, because of
in terms of policies and practices that we want to
because
influence.
Because of the effective veto power that we have at the Board of Governors level. So in exchange for the additional funding, we required certain reforms to take place. These were reforms, by the way, that we've been pushing for many years, so both Democratic as well as Republican administrations. One of the nice things about my job is that it's actually fairly nonpartisan, which is so it really, I think I'm able to have very rational discussions with most people when we talk about the work of the bank. Anyway, so we were able to get, finalize the negotiations in Cancun, but then the governors instructed the board to implement that macro framework agreement, if you will. And those were very intense negotiations took place over a couple of months. And we were done, then that agreement went back to the governors for a final signature. And the ensuing year and several months, we have been, I've been leading obviously one of the major people in charge of making sure that the bank lives up to that portion of the agreement. At the same time, that we're working very closely with Treasury in an approach to the Congress so that they were able to fully appreciate how important the IDB is for the reasons that you mentioned.
And what's our deadline here? And what would the consequences be if we don't step fully up to our share of?
In the case of the IDB, our first payment is due at the end of next month, $102 million. Luckily, in the case of the IDB, there's a charter provision that prohibits other shareholders from diluting us. So if we don't step up and provide the funds, we will not be diluted. However, I can tell you that we will be even less popular than we are now. It'll keep the bank from doing the additional lending, which we think is so good for the region, and not just for the region, but for the reasons that Ian alluded to. An economically strong and politically stable region is one that will demand our goods and services. And so the better off that the region is from an economic perspective, the better off we're going to be over the long run. So I think it's important for that reason. The financing needs of the region are what they are. And so, capital will find its way to the users of that capital. And so if we don't provide those funds, I'm concerned that others will provide those funds. And I love competition, and I just hate to have my hands tied behind me and not be able to compete in that kind of an environment. Well, that means a couple of things. One, it means a loss of U.S. leadership, both vis-a-vis the region, because others will step in, and I don't have to say who those others might be, but we can all come up with at least one or two names. It's also going to be a loss in leadership within the institution. I think that we've been very effective in using our soft power, in part because of our leadership, in part because of being able to provide the funds when it really mattered, and I'm concerned about the effect it'll have there. And also, not only will others step in, but I should mention, they're not going to have nearly the kinds of good conditions that we impose on this kind of programming. Again, I don't have to mention names of any countries, but there are countries who will lend a lot of money, and the only condition by and large is that whatever projects are being executed in the recipient countries utilize the employees from that particular country. And of course, have the loan be paid, not timely basis. That is not the case with the IDB. There are a lot of conditions that we impose that we think are in furtherance of economic.
That are good policies, that are environmental policies, social policies.
And those, I'm afraid, will not be able to press.
With the same kind of influence. Let's turn and talk about what's the circumstance inside the World Bank and how we've come up to the general capital increase, our role in it, and what you're seeing and what role you play as this conversation proceeds.
Great, thank you, Jen. So the World Bank has historically been very well managed financially, fairly conservative, very, very cautious with its finances. Sometimes criticized for being too cautious.
Exactly.
And in 2008, weathered the crisis very, very well and was well capitalized. The rest of the world was reeling, and trade finance was drying up. And many, many countries really worried about losing a decade worth of development gains. So President Obama and other world leaders in early 2009 called on the World Bank and the MDBs to step up their lending, to be countercyclical forces, to try to arrest what was really feared to be a dramatic global slide, which would catastrophic consequences across the globe.
To step out when others were pulling back.
Step out when others were pulling back, to engage in trade finance really aggressively. When private capital flows, which had dropped by about 60% in the developing world, as they were dropping, to step in and try to fill some of that gap so that all those people for those projects wouldn't suddenly become unemployed. The business could continue and that there'll still be demand for U.S. goods and U.S. exports. So the World Bank responded to that call. World leaders said, "You're well capitalized now. We need you to step in," and the bank did, and really, lent into the crisis and kind of strained its balance sheet much more in response to the call from global leaders, and tripled the amount of lending to developed worlds, sped up its grants to the poorest countries, implemented a whole bunch of programs, again, emergency crisis to deal with the food, fuel, and financial crisis in some countries, particularly dealing with emergency food security programs. Made sure that countries actually would implement safety nets to help the poorest during the crisis. And the bank was actually quite successful, playing a significant role. But it did that at a financial cost. And the bank now needs to restore its balance sheet and be able to kind of rebuild its financial structure so that it can continue to lend at a time when we still want it to play an active role. The World Bank also has a large capital increase request. The cost to the U.S. On an annual basis, paid-in cost is about $117 million a year for 5 years. It's a 5-year payment period. So actually, the actual cost out of our pockets is very little. But for every dollar we invest in the World Bank, we get about $25 worth of lending around the world. You talk about leverage. It's incredibly important leverage. I mean, Ronald Reagan did the last capital increase for the World Bank. In 1988, with a $400-some-odd million capital increase, it led to $375 billion of lending around the world. That's a good return on U.S. investment. And not only is it a good financial leverage, it's important policy and influence leverage. And we get to, as Gustavo rightly said, I think we're much more comfortable with our standards on lending and on the environmental standards and social safeguards and making sure that the conditionality is appropriate than we are with some of the tied-in agreements that other countries and other lenders sometimes insist upon. So this is important, very, very important for us. We are now have 5 years to pay in. In the U.S., there is a risk if we do not fulfill our commitments on the capital increase that our veto power could be compromised. Everybody has time to pay in, but if they pay in much faster than we do, or we don't fulfill our commitments, our 15% threshold, right now we've got a 16% voting power. If that were to drop below 15%, we'd lose our veto over changes to the Article of Agreement. Now, it's not all about veto power. It's about influencing the institution. And it's not all about, frankly, the capital increases. Also, many people in the street probably care a lot about IDA and the World Bank's Fund for the Poorest. People look to the U.S. for leadership. They listen to us because they know that we keep our commitments. We keep our commitments through political transition. We honor the commitments of past generations of political leaders here because we know that we want people to respect when the U.S. says it's going to do something, it does it. Well, leaders start to worry, and we start to hear from other countries now saying, is the U.S. going to be able to keep its commitment? And I think some countries see that as, maybe we can get off the hook too, and then we'll see a real drop-off in funding levels for the poorest. Other countries see it perhaps as a strategic opportunity to increase their voice and influence in these institutions. So I think these consequences are it's not tomorrow we're going to have a problem, but we really take this very seriously. Because one of the things I see as a core part of my job is strengthening U.S. influence in these institutions. And that gets harder if we don't pay our bills. And it's the general capital increase. It's the selective capital increase. It's IDA. We've also committed a number of important initiatives on food security. The Global Agricultural Food Security Program, GASP. We pledge a significant amount of money, and we're trying to make sure that gets funded as quickly as we can because we want to get our leverage benefits. Others wait for us to pay in sometimes. 21 countries have been turned away from this fund already who want to actually do it and do it in a way that complies with the U.S. Feed the Future initiative process, but they've turned away because the fund doesn't have money right now. So the latest Senate appropriations mark includes some resources for it, not everything the president asked for. The House mark has 0. So we'll see what Congress will work on that. It's also the clean technology funds. It's just climate change, a number of important environmental initiatives to help poor countries make the more sustainable choice. Sometimes coal seems cheap to them, renewable seems expensive. Can we make renewable seem less costly to them in the short term because the benefits are so important to them long term? Again, without the resources, it's hard to have that influence.
Can you each speak, you've alluded to this, but say a little more about this being so important from your standpoint. And I should say here, though I think you probably all have it in mind, that we have representatives of 2 of the MDB network. But you have, in addition to this, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the, who have I left out? Asian, African, EBRD?
That's the main
that's our, and the International Monetary Fund. So it's a set of institutions who interactively deliver on a multilateral basis to the world. So say a little, if this is so important to us, what is the administration doing? And I know that neither of you can lobby, so I'm not, but what is the administration doing to make known the value and what we get out of honoring our commitment to the general capital increase? And what would you like for those of us in this room when we leave? What would you like us to take away? What would you like us to do? Is there something you think that others can do as citizens who are concerned about development? What can we do to influence the outcome?
Well, just very briefly, first, before we entered into the agreement, we made sure we worked very closely with folks on the Hill, people that we know feel very strongly about these issues, that in these negotiations we reflected those views, making sure this bank ultimately is more accountable, more effective, more transparent, etc. So I think even before we agreed, even before we had to ask Congress for the funds, we wanted to make sure we reflected their views. And then after the agreement, at the highest level, certainly Secretary Geithner has devoted time to this. Leo Brainerd, the Undersecretary, has spent a fair amount of time working with Marissa Lago, the Assistant Secretary, and with the legislative team, trying to really develop a very strong case, which I believe they have, both on national security grounds as well as economic grounds, not to mention the more imperative of doing this, which I think everyone gets. But I think we're living in very difficult economic times. The fiscal environment, everyone knows, is very hard. And I think the Congress has a right, and as citizens, we have a right to ask, what are we getting for our investment at these MDBs? And I think the Treasury has done a very good job in making that case, and will continue to make that case as these votes are being taken.
I think you're exactly. I mean, certainly, Secretary Geithner, Secretary Gates, and now Secretary Panetta have been quite active, on the Hill, talking about the importance of the institutions. And many members on the Hill have also been quite helpful. There have been a number of hearings to really bring in witnesses to talk about the security implications of the MDBs, the role in poverty, the role in creating jobs. And a number of senior military officials have come and testified alongside Treasury officials and others. So there is certainly a strong effort, and many members of the development community, have realizing what's at stake. Particularly, they're focused generally more on IDA at the World Bank, or the concessional windows, the soft loan windows are really focused on grants or credits to the poorest countries. To remind people, both the general public and also congressional staff and members about the importance of these programs, the importance for debt relief, the importance to free the poor, so they can become stronger middle class, more stable societies. In terms of what people here can do, as we said before, often amazing how little people understand about these institutions, or even about we've all seen the little quip on foreign assistance. People think we spend far more than we do. We spend less than 1% on our international affairs. If you get the American public thinks, oh, you must spend 20%, you should spend no more than 10%. We spend less than 1% now. So I think it's important people who have with an interest in development and global issues to be ambassadors about it. Not just for the individual banks or any particular congressional ask, but about why this matters. Why? So this is the long term. We've led in this field for the past 60+ years, and we want to continue to. So so in terms of your children, your neighbors, why does this matter? We need to have a lot of people who care about this.
I just add that Ian mentioned former Secretary of Defense Gates, and there was an event about a year ago when the U.S. was launching the President's development initiative, and he was asked a question about, someone said, why are you here? You're Secretary of Defense, what does it have to do with development? And he gave a very blunt answer, one that I don't think I would have given.
But you're happy to quote.
But I'm happy to quote, which is, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically said it's a lot cheaper to make this kind of investment now than basically, when all hell breaks loose, and then we have to sit in Marines later on. Now, I hope we don't live in that world anymore. I'm from Latin America. I'm reminded, we recently celebrated the bank the 50th anniversary of the Alliance for Progress. And there was a wonderful quote from President Kennedy when he was launching the alliance, where he said that, I think we're talking 1961, and he said that those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution likely. I was born in a communist dictatorship, which was Cuba. So for me, those words aren't just words that they're eloquent. They also mean a fair amount. And thankfully, the region that is Latin America has changed drastically, except for one country over the last 20, 25 years. So, and I would just, democracy has not been consolidated in each of those countries. And I would hate to see a situation where we go back to some of the bad old days, when the United States, because of our leadership, because of our strategic interest in the Western Hemisphere and globally, has to go back in. So.
Thank you so much. I want to turn it now to bring our audience. And do you have any questions, though, for the audience? Is there anything you'd like to hear from them, other than whether they understand what's at stake?
So one of the things the bank has done that I'm really excited about, and my office in the U.S., a lot of emphasis on, is opening itself up, becoming much more transparent. So it's a question if anyone here has actually gone to look at some of the open data that's now available to the bank free of charge, or the new mapping technology, to really try to make the whole aid industry much more transparent. So I have at least one person actually used it, but let me urge you, maps.worldbank.org, data.worldbank. I think that this can really start transforming this field, which I think has not always been as robust and innovative as it can be.
Thank you, thank you. Stacey, I think you have questions that have come in live stream, or where do you want us to start?
The live stream questions last.
Okay, good. And we have roving mics, so if you raise your hand, the mic will find its way to you. And please identify yourself so that we all know who's in the conversation, and especially those online.
Chapter board, thank you both, and good luck on this effort. I wonder if you might comment on the Solomon, on the juxtaposition of the GCI and the change in leadership of the World Bank. I will not ask you to atone for Hillary, but I did want to just ask whether it forces the administration to make sure there's an American, because you don't want to antagonize those in Congress that want to keep this an American institution, or are there other dynamics at play in this?
Sure. Well, in my view, very clearly, is the U.S. has been very well served by having American presidents at the bank since its founding. It's not a right or an entitlement we have, but it's something we take very seriously. We want to have good leadership that is responsive to U.S. interests there. We've been very clear also that we believe it should be a merit-based, transparent, open process. So my very strong hope is that we will put forward a very, very strong American candidate. I'm not mentioning any names, I'm not sure who they would be, but that we put forward a very strong candidate, and I will articulate and advocate very strongly for the best leadership of the World Bank. We've been well served in the past by our leaders. I think Zelek's done a good job. Wolfwood's did a good job. Wolfwood's had major accomplishments there as well. So I think that we want to continue the strong tradition we have, but we do realize that this world continues to evolve, and people look to America for leadership. And we want to provide it.
Great. I see some questions over here. And then back there.
Thank you. Melissa Lino, I work with Northrop Grumman, which is a corporation that does more than defense contracting.
Exactly.
There's been a great deal written about what does and doesn't work in development, and Mr. Solomon touched on country ownership, which is what the MCC is all about, is country ownership. I wonder if both of you would comment whether you have a personal philosophy about what makes development take off, what makes a Chile or a South Korea succeed when others that have had the same kind of input from development over the years do not.
Thank you. Before I turn it over to the panelists, I just observe, I'm glad that you spoke up, because I realize that one point we haven't touched on in this conversation, but I've certainly observed in the time since I left the institutions and the MDB system, is a very significant acceleration in the commitment to working with the private sector and with civil society sector, with development organizations, with business, and a conviction to your question that actually what these institutions can do to catalyze the engagement of the private sector is as important as what they do directly. And I'm so pleased to see them becoming more open to partnerships in academia, with business, with civil society, development organizations, and I think that may be an important point that we maybe didn't draw out enough, because again, the capital increase which will enable them to carry on is not just to carry on what they do, but what they do in partnership. How would you each answer the question?
Well, I think it's a fantastic question, and I don't have a complete philosophy yet. One key tenet is humility. We need to admit that there's a lot more we don't know than we do know, and we want to keep being open and self-critical and trying to learn and make sure these institutions, all of them, our bilateral ones as well as our multilateral ones, are set up to learn from experience. Second is that really it's about the choices of the public and private leaders in the countries themselves. We're not going to impose development from anywhere, not from the U.S., not from the banks. It's going to have to be driven by the public and private leaders in those countries. And I say private leaders to include both for-profit, non-profit, civic leaders, political leaders. It's really the choices that they make. So the question is, how do we best support those choices? And how do we best make sure that those private leaders have the resources? And I think the level of private sector and civil society engagement is absolutely essential. And if you want to have the right balance, it's important to have strong political leaders. We also want strong private leaders. We want business, but also I think anytime the balance gets too skewed, you could run into serious problems. The bank, and certainly the IFC, the private sector arm of the bank, has really ramped up dramatically in support for the private sector. In sub-Saharan Africa, for example, about 8 years ago, investments were about $200 million a year to sub-Saharan Africa. They're $2.1 or $2.2 billion last year. This is supporting businesses, private businesses in Africa. I think that's going to be a key part of some of the success we've seen in Africa. We had a very good decade. Right now, we're seeing faster growth rates in Africa than anywhere else in the developed world, and higher investment returns in Africa than anywhere else, even in the developing world. So I think that the role of the private sector is going to be key. And I think that as part of a philosophy, we want to continue to push and learn in that space, and continue to see how we can get the private sector and public sector to work better together. There was a great event at Treasury just last week with the World Bank, but public-private partnerships around infrastructure and energy. How are we going to, we know that the public resources are not going to be enough, but we need the regulatory systems to work, and we need the governance to really be appropriate. And the private sector, maybe if they don't trust the government's going to actually fulfill its payments and have the right offtake agreements, they're not going to participate. So how do we get the public and private to work together? And what's the role of these institutions to really help facilitate that? And I think this is going to be an area we're going to start hearing more about, not just in developed worlds, but in the U.S. too. How do we get the public and private to really better serve the real needs of the people?
Just simply to complement what Ian said, and this may sound like a rather mechanical response to what is at heart a question about philosophy. I think development works best when you can measure it. It's hard to, first of all, just from an empirical perspective, it's hard to know whether it's working or not unless you can measure it. And I think in those countries with whom we work, where you can measure results the best. I mean, just think about the United States as the gold standard, for example, in economic development. Think about every day how we're bombarded with all kinds of economic data. I think in those countries that have good data and are able to measure, it speaks well about a political system that is serious about development, that wants to, they're so serious they want to subject themselves to criticism. They want to subject themselves to ultimate tests about whether or not something is effective or not. Knowing, I think, with a confidence that if something doesn't work, doesn't mean that we're going to stop the funding. It just means that we have to redirect that funding. We have to do a better job at the program.
Well, it also, you're pointing out an important thing, that data allows citizens to hold their governments accountable. So that, and I think that this is an area in which all of the multilateral system has made huge contributions in tracking and in making more transparent and more available the information citizens can use to hold their governments accountable. So thank you for that question. Yes, back here. And I see right there. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation. My name is Hernan Rosenberg, formerly with WHO World Organization, currently independent consultant. The question is for both, but really more for Mr. Arnavat. How do you see the multilateral institutions of lending as many of the countries sort of graduate into level, and particularly relevant in the Americas? A number of Latin American countries have sort of broken out of the poorest of the poor and that sort of thing. So that I think that development is not just poverty. I mean, it's an element, but it's not just that. But how do you see this evolving in the future? Because it's been a concern in terms of financial flows, particularly in the Americans. Thank you.
That's a good question. Thank you.
Yeah, this is an interesting topic. From the outset, we just say that there is no policy of graduation at the IDB, unlike at the World Bank, for example. So I could stop right here and say it's an irrelevant question for us. But let me just take a couple of minutes to say the following. This is an issue that I know Treasury has been looking at. I know that folks at Capitol Hill look at various countries in the region, and they wonder why, you know, we have limited dollars, so why not redirect those dollars to the countries that really need the funding the most? The Haitis of the region, Honduras, a number of countries that are really very poor, much poorer than the middle income countries, and I won't name those countries. So I know that there is some concern about that. In the case of the IDB, I've had this discussion with a number of my fellow EDs, particularly from borrowing countries, and they feel very strongly that the IDB is a very different institution than the World Bank. In fact, it is majority owned by the borrowing countries, and so they see it very much as a developed institution that should benefit all of the borrowing countries. But it is a good question that you posed.
Yeah, just to add to that, resources are scarce for development, so we really need to be very careful where we're putting our resources to make sure that those are places that really need it. And I think in the middle-income countries, we need to make sure that our resources are really going to, you know, the poorest of the poor. Because even there's a lot of significant poverty even in middle-income countries, poverty in wealthy countries as well. We have poverty right here. So are we targeting our resources in a way that really is either, you know, having a catalytic effect to help the poorest in the middle-income countries to improve situations? Are we addressing some of the global public goods issues like climate change, where a little bit of our resources might get a country that, because it's growing well, might be actually a big emitter of greenhouse gas emissions? Can we get them with some strategic investments to actually have a cleaner, more sustainable energy footprint for themselves? And I think that, you know, this is an important debate we're having now, and we'll continue to have, because resources may be scarce for a while. And how do we make sure that you know, we're getting the right sort of development outcomes for these scarce development dollars? I've asked this question to some of my middle-income colleagues on the board, and they're quite clear that oftentimes they want the bank involved because they like the bank's standards. They trust the bank's procurement systems. They want that expertise from the bank, and they want to know and to signal a sense to others that this is a clean project, this is a project that actually is going to have high standards for environmental safeguards and social safeguards. And there's not going to be fraud and corruption. So the question is, are we doing as good a job as we can, transferring some of that skills and transferring some of that expertise to the countries themselves and building their capacity to have high standards for themselves?
Why don't we take a couple of questions at a time, because I want to get to everyone, so why don't we'll take maybe 3 together and then.
I'm Joan Duke. I also coming out of USA State and now at GW, and I also got to work at the World Bank for a little while. I've got just a couple of things. One, you wanted to know what you wanted to hear from us. I am in mourning for the loss of the front part of global development finance. It is very hard to find the financial data of the banks since that part of the report has been.
Can you speak a little closer to your mic?
Sorry,
Okay.
I said I'm in mourning for the disappearance of the first part of the global development finance report because it makes it very hard to find the simple data on financial flows to developing countries. So I take that back. The website is not too easy to navigate, the idea of the website. I also wanted to, and you alluded to this, but I think in this climate on debt, it's important to emphasize that the callable capital that we pay into the bank doesn't count against the debt, the U.S. debt or the U.S. deficit, and it makes it much easier for our administration to fund the banks than to fund even the bilateral aid program or the UN contributions. This is, in this climate, that's a huge advantage that the bank has. In terms of questions, I was wondering, because I used to manage USAID side relations with the bank, what's the interagency process that you go through to determine U.S. positions on individual projects that the executive board works on? That's question number 1. How are the banks working in the field? And my third question is...
What was the second one?
The second one is, how is the bank working with other donors, both the IDB and at the field level, the old coordination question? How do you see that? And my last point would be for all the young people in the room, how are the banks doing in terms of their quota, excuse the term, of U.S. employment? Jen, the way back, so you're not surprised that I asked that question.
Wow. I said would aggregate a few questions, but we've got a whole set right there. Maybe let's let you jump in on these, and then the mics can find. Will you put your hands up if you have a question so the mics can find their way to you? Okay, we've got some here. All right, so talk fast. But I heard, first there's a question. Pardon me? You have a list. Okay, we'll jump in.
So on the Global Development Finance Report, we can look into that. My colleague, Mike, one of my advisors here, we can see what happened to that. I think your point about, the callable capital, the bank has to pay in about 6% of our capital contribution. The other 94% is callable if needed. That enables the bank to use the AAA credit rating of the United States to then say, okay, and other donors too, because of our credit rating, they can then issue bonds to raise more capital. So our small amount of paid in Mexican lets the banks to raise a lot of money for lending out at good rates. So it's a good point that the $117 million a year for the next 5 years is not even a rounding error for our overall deficit. Not chump change, it's important money we need to take very seriously and do our due diligence, but it's a very small amount. This is not making our deficits worse. The interagency process. I have in my office,
I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, we share a senior foreign commercial service officer from the Commerce Department who's been working very closely with both of us, and one of the things he's done in my office is we've set up a whole bunch of these private sector liaison offices across the U.S. To help U.S. businesses learn more about how the bank works, get trained in bank procurement policies. The first one was in Chicago. They increased the amount of bank procurement to businesses around Chicago by 83% in their first year of operation.
Wow.
I'm going out to Salt Lake City, Utah tomorrow to talk to another one. We had 3 when I started. We now have 9 of these offices set up around the country. And it's not just the World Banks, for the MDBs to reach out to the U.S. business community, so that we get all the information that we can have to compete effectively with others.
You wish there were one in Washington?
You heard a request. Okay.
Actually, there's one in Baltimore right now. So we have a Commerce Department person. I also have a representative from USAID in my office, who previously to that was at on the National Security Staff of the White House, so he's a master of the interagency process and has worked very closely to improve the level of integration between the World Bank and USAID. We've done a number of initiatives, including a great memorandum of understanding on water issues, where Secretary Clinton came over to work with the bank and do a big announcement with President Zellick about how do we get NOAA, USAID, the World Bank, all engaging more effectively on issues like water, which is a critical issue. Coordination at the field level is mixed. I think it's always been mixed. There's some examples where I get a project, and as EDs, we have to review every single project that comes to the board. And sometimes we send it out to the field missions, and they say, we love it, we helped design it. And that's what I love, when the USAID folks are actually actively engaged with bank staff and country staff really developing the program. Other times, we get no response at all. So one of the things we're trying to work is making sure we get better feedback from the field level. But it's clearly, it's an important objective, for all of our offices to improve this coordination. So in terms of the number of U.S. employees at the bank, one of the things that Jan did that I've tried to keep is reach out to U.S. nationals who work for the bank. And I've been doing these informal coffees, about from 60 to 120 people at a time for the whole year and a half I've been there. We're doing them regularly. And when went out to 4,700 some odd U.S. nationals who were part of the bank groups. So we pay attention to this, and we also want to make sure that the bank's U.S. staff is as diverse as the U.S. population.
The bank has awarded $1.35 roughly in contracts to U.S. businesses. One of the occupational hazards of coming to applying a job is that coming to panels like this and hearing Ian talk about how much more staff he has than as you mentioned, in terms of coordination is an issue. We work very closely with Treasury. As Ian said, all of the programs, all the loans, all the guarantees have to be carefully reviewed. And to the extent that they require the review of other agencies, if it's an environmental project, we'll get EPA involved, then we do so. I think the biggest challenge for me has been coordination outside of that very formal structure, so that at the State Department or USAID, I don't have someone dedicated to USAID projects as part of my staff, but if one of those U.S. agencies or others want to interact with the bank, sometimes they don't even know there's a USAID.
Right, exactly.
It's
not that well known.
They're instantly just call directly to the president's office, etc. But even so, it's a lot of times there is no coordination, there's no effort to coordinate, and it's something that's a challenge. And I can assure my fellow appointees in other agencies that getting their goals accomplished, it'll be much more effective if they work with my office, so we understand what the bank can and can't do in terms of timing. And there are times where we're involved in very delicate negotiations, not only with other EDs, with management, and it's not the right time, or it is the right time, to talk about engagement in particular other areas. And I think in my office, I in particular, I think I have a really good sense of where the negotiations are on any various issues. It's important to coordinate carefully with us.
Great.
The amazing thing is just one more, it's a lot on this, but something I take very seriously because part of our global development policy is a whole of government approach that we tap in. So, I've been from the Department of Justice. We're engaged in issues of citizen security in Latin America, where the bank team's engaged in Latin America. We've had talked to folks at the Department of Interior and Fisheries on different issues around the world, and I think there's a real receptiveness. The bank is an extraordinary resource of knowledge and expertise and contacts around the globe and convening power. And if we can help U.S. agencies benefit from that, at the same time we're debating conference travel and stuff like that for agencies, if they can get access to the bank resources, we ought to exploit that, and I see that very much as part of my job.
Great. Let's take 3 more questions here, and we'll group them and then come back and give you the answers.
Julia Peroni, economist, independent consultant of the bank. My question has to do with the impending general capital increase and the evolving role of the emerging markets. One would expect for the World Bank these negotiations to be much more difficult because there will be restructuring in the voice, in the role of the emerging markets. And for the Inter-American Development Bank, that will not be such a problem. Would you think that in Congress there would be such a distinction between the two agencies and Inter-American Development Bank of an easier time? Just your comments on the whole issue. Thank you.
Okay, let's take a couple more and we'll group them together. See what
While I'm
number.
walking over, we did get one interesting question from the live stream, which is, please comment on the relationship between the GCI and the ability of the banks, both the IDB and the World Bank, to help developing countries that might get caught in a tsunami if Europe and the US go into a double dip.
Whoa.
My name is David Goodson. I'm with Resolve. We're a independent nonprofit organization, and we've been working with the MDBs and including the World Bank on the climate investment funds and helping with the observer selection process with civil society. So my question to both of you, both touched on accountability and transparency, is what role do you see in terms of increasing civil society participation and engagement in decision making? Thanks.
Okay, do we have one more? Because I think this may be our last round. I see a hand over here. That's right over here. I want to say this is a great audience, and as we're coming near the close, you've all been terrific in illuminating points of this discussion with your comments and your
Hello,
questions.
my name is Antonio Calzada. I'm an independent consultant. My question is in regards to a very strong topic that's being discussed across the world regarding food security. And my question in regards to how you see the trend, is there a stronger position in regards to feeding from abroad or from within? From within the region, from within the country, helping the country feed itself, or
Okay.
strengthen the positioning of
The
feeding
capacity of
from
a
abroad?
country. Okay, good. All right, let's dive in. And I don't think you each have to answer them all. So the first one is this question of the evolving role of the emerging markets, and whether in the GCI, is there a distinction being made between, say, the IDB and the World Bank, or is it?
Well, as part of the negotiations around the general capital increase was associated with a discussion about voice, about the level of participation, the amount of shareholding of developing countries. And the U.S. was we believe that these institutions do need to evolve to better reflect local realities. And as part of that, there was a shift of several percentage points to the emerging market economies to give them more of a voice in these institutions. Now, people wanted that to come out of the U.S. and the U.S. to give up its voting power. My sense is the U.S. is not overrepresented. In fact, there are other countries that might be overrepresented. The U.S. is not one of them. So we eagerly support greater voice in developing countries. And I think that it is a bit different because at the World Bank, the developed countries still have a majority of voting power, whereas the IDB, the borrowing countries, have
As
a
you
majority.
referred to earlier.
Yeah, actually, I spent 20 years on Wall Street. So when I hear emerging markets, I'm thinking of capital flows. But thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, in the case of the IDB, it's not written anywhere in the charter, but the president has traditionally been from the region. The borrowing countries, as I said, collectively own more than 50%. And that's a good thing. It means that the message is that the fate of the institution, just like the fate of their countries, is in the hands of the leadership. So we don't have those issues at the IDB.
Good. And then on the, I have this very interesting question about the relationship between the capital increase and whether these institutions will be poised should we see a tsunami in the wake of what's going on now in the U.S. and the European economies.
Well, how much time do we have?
Yeah.
From a capital flows perspective, there's going to be a risk aversion to the developed markets and more emphasis on the developing markets, right? And so the emerging markets, like Brazil, for example, we know that they've been very critical of the role that developed economies have played and the effect it's having on the value of their currency. When we were negotiating, we were thinking about what the size of the envelope would be for the capital increase. We were very much mindful of both. We were really thinking about capital flows and the kind of demands for capital flows in the region. And I think the region actually has done quite well, much better than I think anticipated, I would say. But it is a concern. I know it was a concern of the borrowing countries when we're negotiating the size of the envelope. What happens if there is a double dip? I'm not an economist. I don't see a double dip occurring. The more we talk about it, the real likelihood it will occur, right? Self-fulfilling prophecy. But it certainly, if we don't get the capital increase, without a doubt, the IDB will not be in as good a position to respond to the liquidity needs of the region if we do get it.
Similar.
We're certainly better off having well-capitalized multilateral financial institutions.
Then we have the question about the role of civil society, whether there's an opportunity or a trend for greater participation and being heard in these institutions, which it is always a little tricky because they are owned by member governments. And so I know Larry Summers used to reflect on the question of, yes, we believe very deeply, as in the US, in the engagement of civil society and direct dialogue. And at the same time, if these institutions are engaging directly with civil society, are they contravening the government? And how do we balance this? So what are you seeing is occurring now?
Well, certainly and I'm glad you mentioned the Climate Investment Fund, because there's a model that really tried to build in civil society participation in the governance structure, and we did something very similar to the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program, realizing that there's an important voice. Oftentimes they provide good guidance on the ground, good relationships, and frankly, it's much, you can achieve better results when they're engaged than not. It doesn't take the burden off civil society themselves to improve their own accountability and transparency, and the bank can play a role with that. So I think the CIFS models and the new trust funds are really trying to learn on this experience and how best to engage civil society. It's certainly a real emphasis right now at the bank is how do we better engage civil society, and the bank's even toying with different models of it. Is there a way to better support civil society? Support can be technical assistance, because we want to make sure that the civil society we engage with actually are representative, are accountable themselves. I don't think it serves anyone to have, if we have European funding, are there funding sources? So how do we strengthen them? Because it's certainly our view that citizen engagement is an important part of development. It's an important balance in the countries, and important to help hold the bank accountable. So I think this is a very important area, not one that's universally welcomed. It does make certain people suspicious, and I think this is going to be an important and complicated debate, but one that we think is there's some good evidence that we need to keep building on and learning from to pursue.
And in the IDB, what are the?
No, it's very critical to engage civil society. Again, we have to have a balanced approach. One of the things that we did concretely in connection with the GCI was we got the bank to agree to come up with a new mechanism to investigate whenever the bank is involved in programming and they violate a particular policy that hurts individuals. Civil society can step in and avail themselves of that process. It's an independent mechanism, consultative investigative mechanism, and there are various layers. And so, just give you an example, we're going to build a dam somewhere. This may mean displacing 1,000 families in a particular valley. We have policies in place that we think are rational policies, and the question is, are those policies being followed or not? If they're not, civil society can bring a case to this mechanism for review. As Ian said, these are not welcome mechanisms. In the case of the IDB, prior to the fee mechanism, in 15 years, I think we had 5 cases brought. Under the new mechanism, which has been in place for a little over a year, we have had about over 24 already brought. Now, all those are not formal cases, but it goes to show you that I think that we've done a good job in at least sending out the message to this new day at the IDB when it comes to holding the bank accountable and helping civil society. Now, there's still growing pains. It's a mechanism that we're working our way through, and we still have to keep fighting for what we think are the right policies and the right implementation of this policy. But I think so far, so good.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing that out, because in fact, all of the MDBs now have mechanisms like this, so I'm really happy to hear about the strengthening of the IDBs that has resulted in a greater uptake, and those mechanisms are in place, and largely because of the civil society approaching the Treasury and over 20 years ago and saying this is needed, and eventually we succeeded on that. We're nearly out of time, so I want to give you each a moment to say any final closing words.
Sure, and I'm going to also address the feeding.
Oh, yes. Oh, I'm so sorry. Thank you. Yes, because that's a very important question.
Food security is a critical issue to me, so I'm happy to make that on my...
And bringing out that point about whether it's shipping in or building capacity in a country to feed itself. So thank you for...
Well, I think this illustrates, when I first started, when I came to the administration after Obama got elected, the first thing I worked on was food. One of the first things was food security with the Treasury Department. And the whole Feed the Future initiative, of which Treasury has a piece that it works on with the World Bank. And a big part of that is helping countries try to figure out their food security policies on their own. So the bank is not saying you must feed from within or you must buy from without. The bank is saying, okay, do you have the capacity to analyze these questions for yourself and to tap the relevant external partners for support where you need it? And in some countries it may be an internal policy, in others it's going to be, it's going to be buying from abroad. In many places like we have here, it's going to be a mix. So rather than dictating a top-down approach to development, which we've shown doesn't work sustainably, how do we actually have a more sophisticated, responsible dialogue around it? And I think that's kind of, as Mike, I think that's kind of the evolution that I've seen when I was, I lived in South Africa, about 20 years ago, and we criticized the bank. The bank was this big, evil imposer of doctrines and dictates. And the amazing thing to me is the bank can and does change. Not always as fast as we want it to, not always in exactly all the dimensions we want. I mean, on every dimension here, I have a long list of things that I keep pushing, and an agenda for further reforms and modernization that's critical for the institution to achieve its potential. But it does change. And that's why it's so important for the U.S. to stay engaged, to demonstrate to the rest of the world that we care about these institutions, that we take our shareholding and our stakeholding very seriously, and we keep our commitments.
Thank you.
Just briefly, the GCIs are important because they provide the United States with a very strong and effective voice in influencing development policies that ultimately lead to U.S. economic and strategic security in a very expansive way.
Great. And I do want to mention, for those who might be having conversations afterwards, Mike Killefer, raise your hand, who is on Ian's staff and who is point of contact with all of us in this community, and both of your staffs, I think, have been doing a great job in being accessible to others. So I hope you'll join me in a round of applause for our two great panelists.